And that previous session was just fantastic. And I'm going to, I think, go beyond sex. I'm going to go beyond sex into conception, pregnancy, and the importance of that time of our lives for our later lives. What I'm really going to argue, in a sense, is that our body weight today and why we might be vulnerable to obesity has got more to do with what our mother ate before birth, our birth, than perhaps what we ate after our birth. So let's see if we can tease that out a bit. So we'll just move through. That's great. So it's no surprise to all of us in this room, there's been a preoccupation, as there should be, as Australians have become increasingly fatter through the last couple of decades. And that's in parallel with across the whole of the Western world, the UK, Europe, and of course, particularly the US. Now, this is a lovely report. It came from the Baker Institute. It got a lot of airplay. And of course, it drew on those figures that said Australian children, Australian adults were progressively going up the body mass index scale, overweight and into obesity. And it drew, of course, on the parallel change that has occurred in our eating and activity habits across that last couple of decades. So the size of sugary soft drinks has gone up, burgers have gone up, transgenic sizes of serves of chips and high fat, high sugar, and of course the increasing propensity to travel by car, diminishing our activity. So the lifestyle elements have come really to the fore. We are all aware of that, how to improve our diet, how to improve our active lifestyle. But against that backdrop of a myriad of weight loss regimes, against the most incredible commitment by individuals, by communities, to do something about the obesity that emerges in later life, it's proved very, very hard to actually achieve a genuine shift back to a healthy weight for those communities and for individuals. And I think it's time that we stopped and asked the question, some of the key questions, about why is it that some of us are very much more prone, in the face of those wonderful serves of dessert or wonderful serves of chips and burgers, prone to actually eating more and gaining weight, whereas others of us may be able to step back from that. It's not simply willpower. There appears to be almost a biological drive in some individuals to overeat. And the second part that's puzzling against knowing what we know about maintaining a healthy body weight is, why is it so hard, actually, for most individuals who, once they lose weight by an absolute effort of will, a huge commitment to really controlling in a very disciplined way their intake over a period of time, why is it that for 95% of people, they will regain the lost weight and then some? Why is it that there's almost a set point for body weight in many of us, which defeat all of our best efforts to lose weight? And it's against that backdrop that I think we can recognise we don't necessarily know the whole picture with human obesity. So what I'd like to bring into this mismatch of what we think we understand, but the consequences of that, which is still an upward swing in our body weight nationally and individually, is to think about a body of work that's carried out in the last 10 years or so that suggests that our early nutritional exposures, as early as being in the womb, set our biology to be more vulnerable to that obesogenic diet that faces us in later life. And that for some individuals, those nutritional exposures set our gain in weight, set our body set point for what we eat, how we eat it, and set our fat cells to be really efficient at storing fat and very, in a sense, determined to retain that fat against all efforts to try and reduce the body fat composition. So in order I can introduce that concept in order to address some of the evidence that we have that this is occurring, I think the first thing to do is to think about the mums who are entering pregnancy heavy. And there's a great deal of evidence to show that heavy mums have heavy babies, and those babies become in their turn heavy as children. So let's look a little bit at that. Firstly, just to set the scene, as more people become obese, as the epidemic of obesity recruits everyone, it recruits women of reproductive age. And you can show any number of studies. This is one from the state of Utah, where it's about 500,000 women, which is why I think it's good. It's across a decade, 91 to 2001. And it just shows that in every category of being overweight or obese or morbidly obese, there's been an increase in that decade of women entering pregnancy heavier. So we also know that for heavy women, as I've said, heavy women tend to have heavy babies who themselves are fat. And this is normal biology. This is something that we understand from a great deal of work, both in women and in animal models of pregnancy. So if you look through pregnancy, women naturally want to, their physiology in pregnancy is to divert fuel, glucose, sugar, through the placenta to the baby. That supports the growth of the baby, the healthy growth of the baby. If the mum has excess nutrition on board, or her tissues are not sensitive to the hormone that pulls glucose into her own tissues, then she'll have a lot of glucose on board. That excess glucose will go through to the baby, and that will cause the baby to grow, because that will promote the baby's own insulin and make the baby actually bigger, but also it will promote the uptake of that sugar into the fat cells of the baby, so you'll have a bigger, fatter baby. Now that's reasonable. It sounds like good, intuitively logical physiology, and you would imagine that after the baby is born, the baby would then return to a normal nutritional environment and actually a normal body weight. But it seems that this sets up a lifetime of obesity itself, because the evidence is that small children born to heavy mums are twice as likely themselves to be heavy as early as 2 years of age. Children born to obese mums by 11 years of age showing early features of the metabolic syndrome, quite an advanced form of a metabolic pathology. And this is a nice study. It was done in Sheffield, and it divided the people who'd all been born in the 1 year into quintiles of birth weight, into fifths. And what they showed for these babies who were born heavy, that is, who were at the upper end of that birth weight distribution, when they were 33, you can see both for men and for women in that slide that they each had a higher body mass index right at that right-hand side at 33. So heavy mums, heavy babies, heavy children, heavy adults. And what that set up the notion, trying to get the slide back now. What that set up the notion is there an intergenerational cycle of obesity? So that mums enter pregnancy heavy, more at risk of high sugar or diabetes in their pregnancy, heavy baby who then goes through their reproductive prime, and so it goes on. Now this is a really important area to try and unpick some of the mechanisms, because whilst we might make the observations in human populations, we have to get under the skin, as it were, of this and understand, is there something biologically going on that would prime one's eating behaviour, prime one's fat cells differently after being exposed to this environment. So most of the scientists in this field have taken a view, well, we could look at the fat cells themselves and how, if you expose them to early overnutrition, what happens to those fat cells for the rest of their life and the fat mass. Or you could look at the appetite regulating system, which we all have in our brain, which is the system that say puts the brakes on when we just feel, no thank you, I won't have dessert, or doesn't put the brakes on and says, oh well, why not? Okay, so maybe the way in which the chemical signals in that neuropeptide system that's in the brain regulating our appetite could be altered and primed in early life, programmed in early life by that early nutritional exposure. So there's been a few studies done in this, but the study I want to talk about, Frank was talking about a very special very special species, very special animal. Well, I'd like to talk about my special animal, and that's not quite as exotic as the platypus, but nevertheless really important to developmental physiology. That's the sheep. And the sheep is the gold standard in developmental physiology. That's why we're all here working on it in Australia, because human development and sheep development actually are very alike, particularly the development of the fat system. Sheep, the little fetus, the little fetal lamb has fat before birth, and also in the brain, those neural networks develop that are going to control appetite in later life, just as they do in the human. So what we've done, I'll just show a little bit of data here. The first thing we've done, and it was a PhD student's project, we gave the pregnant ewes a lot of food, which sheep will eat anything you give them. And they loved it, and they ate it all, and they got fatter in the last month of pregnancy. Their blood sugars were high. The sugar in the fetus was high. And what we found is we found an upregulation, and that's showing in this histogram here, the dark histogram, of a gene which we know makes more fat cells and makes more fat. So we could see that this power, and we showed it was related to the sugar concentrations, the glucose concentrations in the blood of the fetus itself. That's really interesting. But more interestingly was when this PhD student Bev Mulhauser's work, went through to postnatal life, that's great. What we then found is the little lambs that were born in the first month of life to the well-fed ewes, and this is the pink group, and this is whether they were boys or whether they were girls. They themselves were also fatter. They had a high fat mass. So that change in early life, growing more fat cells, had a consequence even after birth. And separately, without going into all of the detail, we found that in the brains of these little lambs who were fatter, their brains weren't listening to the signals that should be telling them not to eat. So they had a downregulation of a receptor that listens to the fat hormone leptin. They had a change in an appetite inhibitor. So we had programmed these little lambs exposed in that last week of pregnancy to have a different body mass and a different way of responding to food in later life. Now that's really, I think, very particularly interesting. But what I do think it's worth now thinking about, and it gets even more interesting, is in terms of, is it just the being heavy during your pregnancy? You see, mothers come into pregnancy heavy, and at the time of conception, we have this lovely small pinhead embryo that's now exposed to that maternal nutritional environment before that little embryo becomes a fetus. Is it possible that it's actually the environment of the conceptional nutritional environment around the embryo that could have an impact for later life, as well as the late fetus? That's a long bow to draw. At conception, when the nutritional demands of that embryo are nothing except that they're very specific. So we asked with Lee Wen Rattentre, who's on the far right there, and that's Lee Wen's sister, whose baby, Lee Wen's sister had gestational diabetes during her pregnancy. And Lee Wen set up the question, how could we separate your mother's weight at conception from being heavy in later pregnancy? Now, most women in pregnancy, if you go into pregnancy heavy, you stay heavy. So we had to go back to our sheep again. And we had to think of a way in which we could isolate just being heavy to around the time of conception. And Lee Wen did this with a group of animals, and I just want you to look at the third column down. These are sheep before pregnancy which are being fed lots, and they love it, and they eat lots, and they get fatter. And that's that third group down. And 6 days after conception, 6 days after mating and conception, the embryo of these sheep were transferred to ewes of normal weight for the remainder of pregnancy, and they gave birth normally, and they had normal lambs. So what we've done is just isolate the time of being exposed to overnutrition to that time. What we also did is put some of the ewes on a diet. So that was the fourth group down. They started heavy, but a month before we then brought them down on a diet to see if we did have an effect in the heavy ewes if we restricted the diet, the heavy restricted group, would that actually remove the effect? So that's a really interesting, and we transferred the embryo to ewes of normal weight at 6 days after conception. And then we had two groups, the normal control group, that's just had the embryo transfer from one normal ewe to another normal ewe, and the control restricted group, which was put on a diet but which wasn't fat. So what a big project. The ewes, pregnancy, many of you may not know, is 150 days. It's about 150 days for a sheep. And then we took the lambs out to 4 months, and this is Li Wen's PhD. And I'm just going to show you one slide from it because it was remarkable. And PhDs are such long, hard journeys, such commitment to this animal experiment, working with the ewes, making sure they're healthy, the lambs are healthy, taking blood samples, making sure everything's right. At 4 months of age, this is the total body fat mass of the female lambs. And what you can see in the big histogram is that those lambs who were conceived in heavy ewes, but transferred to normal weight ewes for the rest of pregnancy, they were fatter than their other colleagues, the controls who are on a diet. And what you can see in the far one is if the lamb had been conceived in a heavy ewe who went on a diet, it reduced the effect. Yay! That's a pretty impressive experiment. It told us for the first time, if you just look at the time of conception, it has an effect on your body weight after birth. How remarkable. And there are all sorts of mechanisms that we believe are underplaying this, that our evolution says we sense our nutritional environment very early in our plastic development, when we've got a lot of potential to change direction biologically, and that the embryo is setting in place in the face of this nutritional environment a suite of changes, some of which we call epigenetic, that is not directly dependent on the DNA base pair sequence, but actually chemical modifications of DNA which are heritable in more cells, and that they are passed on through cell division to eventually make a fat cell that's efficient at storing fat. If you're exposed as an embryo to an increase in nutrition, you say, maybe I've got to get mechanisms to adjust after birth to a life of plenty. Very interesting. And we're also looking at the brain structure and to see whether that change we saw. So you're saying, well, that's all very well, not a problem, just make sure women have a healthy weight before pregnancy. Why would we worry? But I just want to show you one worrying thing, which says to us our biology is so grounded in an evolution where we had to deal with adversity for longer than we've ever had to deal with a time of plenty. And let me just show you one tiny result from what happens when you put those ewes on a diet to the system in the lambs that responds to adversity, the stress response. And what we found is it didn't matter. This is measuring the hormone, which is the stress response on the first graph on the left. And this is the female lambs. And what it shows you in the two bars that go up, these were the lambs conceived in ewes who were either a normal weight and had a diet before conception, or were of a heavy weight and had a diet before conception. This is at 3 months of age. After birth, these lambs have a higher stress response. Their biology knew it was exposed to an adverse, a weight loss, before and at the time of conception. Remarkable. This stress axis in us is very, very robust at picking up our early environment and holding the memory of that environment for the rest of our life. And what that means is we have to be enormously careful, because what we've got is signals of plenty coming into our body fat mass, but the signals of adversity are being read by the embryo, and that embryo will again change the development of its stress response axis to be much more stress responsive after birth. And that's not good for us metabolically. So you can't just have rapid weight loss regimes before pregnancy. We need an evidence base for the optimal weight loss regime, which will not evoke this response in the children afterwards. So I think that this evidence we're seeing across studies is not only these studies in sheep, but a myriad of studies in rodent models, is highlighting that exposure when we're just an embryo or a fetus in the womb to the mother's nutritional environment will have everything to do with how and in what way the intergenerational cycle of obesity continues. And our challenge is to find the right intervention, the right evidence-based regime to make sure we can limit this effect and limit that intergenerational cycle of obesity. And the group in the lab, this work is incredibly time intensive. It's got a lot of airplay because of its significance in the current epidemic of obesity. And this is the team who work both with the animals, with gene expression, and with some of that epigenetic changes in the lab. Thank you.